Okay, lesson 57, homology. We will learn how comparing organisms helps explore evolution. Now, homology or homeology, I think it's homology, is just the study of like similarities between organisms. It's actually very basic. It's actually a very basic sort of study, but we can still use it to our advantage. What it allows us to do is it allows us to sort of formalize. Okay, so why you know a something like a whale's fin and a human's hand, how are they similar? How are they different? Why are they different? That's sort of the questions we're asking. And then that sort of, if they have anything similar at all, then maybe they came from a common ancestor. So that's sort of what we're going to be looking at when we talk about how evolution sort of works. Before we sort of had DNA, we had to, all evolution was understood with homology. It's like, oh, this ancient skeleton looks like a bear, but maybe a small version of a bear. So maybe this was an ancient bear. This skeleton looks like a horse, so maybe it's an ancient horse. So that's what we're going to be looking at and how we understand that. Last lesson I had you guys, we actually looked at the evolution of the horse. We did that over 2 slides. We talked about how, and I've just talked about this already in the lesson fact. We said that the horse got teeth that allowed it to eat better grass. It got taller so it could escape from from predators. It also got lost its toes and just got a hoof because that allowed it to move a lot faster. You can also talk a little bit about the tail. Like obviously the tail has evolved as well to kind of be able to get rid of flies a lot better because there's a lot more flies in the plains than there are in the jungle, and stuff like that, in the forest. And then we talked about how it's not necessarily straightforward. Okay, so you didn't just went from ancient horses to modern horses. There were a lot of different branches that happened over time. Different horses. Like it's almost like evolution tried different versions of a horse. If you go have a look at this point here, let's just take this random point here. Maybe not that, but let's take a straight line. If you took this point right about here in evolution, there is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So that's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different species of horse. Now we only have about 3 species of horse, because, or 3 or 4, because we've got, you know, horses, donkeys, and zebras, and so yeah. And yeah, as I told you guys as well, because these are, even though they are different species, you can still crossbreed them. You can get zonkies, which is a horse, or you can get I think it's like zorses, which is a zebra and a horse, or you can even get mules. A mule is a horse and a donkey combined together. It's just that these things can't go on to have children, so that's the end of the line. Then we spend a little bit of time saying fossils is really great. You know, they've allowed us to understand the evolution of horses and then also explore evolution in general. Humans would later domesticate horses, and of course that would lead to artificial selection or human-guided evolution. But you know, that's a later thing that happened. And then what I did is I set you guys some homework. What I've done is I've changed the homework. Now I want to, before I go too deep into the homework changes, I'd like to make a shout out to 2 students that have already done all of the homework. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm trying to find out a way to like reward those students that have done all the work, done more work than they needed to do. I haven't figured out those students, by the way, the amazing students that already did all this was Elna and Tina. They both submitted all of the questions of 3.9. even though it's not due till next week, they'd already submitted all the questions of 3.9. So I was like massively impressed with them. And so I'm like thinking maybe about something like, oh, maybe they don't have to do the first page of the last page of the worksheet that I'm giving them, or maybe I'll give them an extension on that so they can be a bit slacker. I don't know. But I just want to shout out to them because they did an amazing job of getting it all done. And it's I feel bad because yeah, so yeah, they're both yeah, so they're both sort of like, I think they like the idea of giving them a little bit of extra time to do the worksheet that I'm going to be giving you guys next. But I'll talk to you guys about, like, I'll figure something out with them. But firstly, homework wise, let's pay attention to this. 14th to the 10th, that's today. This is due today. So if you haven't done that, there are 10, as I said, 10 students haven't finished that yet. So that's paying attention. This is due Friday. So if you haven't done this by Friday, that's when it's due. Now for 3.9, that's going to be due next Wednesday. And what I've done is I've cut down a couple of the questions, and I'm going to put, and I've already put this on an updated list of questions onto the classroom. What I've cut it down to do is questions 6, 9, 10, 11, 14, and 16. I've cut out 4 questions. So we've gone from 10 questions down to 6 questions. The reason I've wrote that is because it doesn't look like I cut out questions, but I did cut out a fair few. And what I tried to do is I tried to cut out questions that repeated themselves. And so it's like, okay, you've already done a question like this. So what I've tried to do is minimize it so you're just doing about 1 question on each topic. There will be, of course, some overlap. It's not perfect, but you know, for example, before there was like you had to do 3 questions on the like describing the evolution of horses. I'm like, I don't think you need to do that. I think like 1 question on the evolution of a horse is sufficient. So that's yeah. So good job to Eleanor and Tina. That's what's going to be the homework, and we'll talk about the rest of that later on. Let's get back to today's lesson, homology. Let's start off with before we even describe what homology is, I wanted to talk about the evolution evidence. Now, and I just want you guys, you don't have to necessarily write down every single part of it, but you do every single part. You do need to at least write down what the 4 parts of this study is. So when we came to proving evolution, okay, perhaps the biggest evidence of evolution were fossils, and that's why I spent a whole lesson talking about fossil evidence. And yeah, fossil evidence was the remains of ancient organisms. You don't even need to write down that in brackets. If you know what fossils are, you don't need to write down remains of ancient organisms. But yeah, what that allowed us to do is to get like an idea of how long evolution went, and we could sort of see small changes over time. But we also needed A, which is anatomical structures, body parts. One thing that essentially got people thinking about evolution, is even Darwin, is when he looked at different birds and looked at their beaks. So he's looking at the anatomical structure, anatomy being the way your body is structured. When you look at when you look at birds, they'll have wings, so exploring what those wings look like is an anatomical structure. It's part of, we can use it to evolution. It's how we can tell that, you know, birds and humans, there's a lot of evolutionary gap. Now, with the modern century approaching, we could start doing molecular evidence. So molecular evidence means that instead of looking at the anatomical structure, you could actually break it down and actually look at the DNA. How close is our DNA to other animals? So DNA, RNA, you can look at some of the proteins and amino acids and stuff like that. So that's what molecular evidence means. It means looking at the genes and stuff like that. ATP is a type of adenine triphosphate. It's a type of energy protein that helps with that helps in most animals. So it's just, you know, it's all you need to know. It's a different molecule. You guys know that DNA and RNA are molecules because they're just big long chains of atoms. So ATP is just a new one. Proteins in general, really, in my opinion, is what we use to sort of compare them. And the last part of this fame is embryological. Now, embryological is weird, man. It's the last slide that we're going to look at today, and it's a bit weird. It looks at embryos, and essentially looks at how embryos are similar. Sort of like anatomical, but instead of looking at like an adult bird or an adult, you know, or an adult gum tree, you're looking at like, or even an adult seahorse. You're looking at what these things look like when they are embryos before they're finished developing. And you're trying to see, well, what's similar and what's different. You might be like, whoa, what? Like if the embryo of a gum tree? It's like, yeah, you can actually even look at the embryo of trees and plants as well. They obviously look very, very different, but still. I'll keep this up for a little bit because I know there's a lot of text on this slide. And I know there's always going to be one student that says, I need to write down every single thing on the slide. I don't care if you don't write down every part, especially because a lot of this stuff we're going to talk about again anyway. So it's just maybe you just want to write down the F fossil, A anatomical structures, M molecular evidence, and E embryological. That's fine, but you know, it's up to you guys. So these are the other things we use to talk about evolution. When we talk about evolution, we said, well, when you talk about you can look at modern dolphins compared to seals. You can like, well, look at their anatomy. They are similar here, and here, but they're different here and here. So they've obviously evolved because of this reason here. And embryological, you can be like, look at, if you then say, well, they don't look very similar, it's like, well, look at the embryo of a dolphin, look at the embryo of a seal, see how they're pretty similar looking when they're in embryo forms. And so it gives you a way you can sort of look at it. All right, I'm going to change the slide in about 20 seconds, unless someone says in chat, please don't. Okay. Oh, it hasn't been 20 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's been 20 seconds. So, we've already talked about fossils. I'm not going to talk about fossils again. We're going to talk about anatomical first. But before we get into anatomical, we need to cover this word that we've started using over and over again. Homology. Oh, well, actually, you know what? Sorry, I forgot about this slide. No pencil here because we've already covered this. Fossils can reveal what kind of organisms lived in the past, how the organisms changed over time, what the organisms ate, how the organisms moved, and what the climate was like. So that's what's really good about fossils, is they give us a bunch of this information just by looking at them. Grabbing a look at these. These are, again, back to horses. It looks at horses' teeth. You can see that horses' teeth have essentially built up in size, and so it makes them even better for grinding. You might say, what do you mean by grinding? It's like, well, you need to have big teeth when it comes to grinding, because you need to be able to apply a lot of force. You need to be able to, you know, in case your teeth wears down, you need to have a lot of tooth to do it. So that's why these are really good for dealing with grasses. We can see how we've gone from 1, 2, 3, 4 toes to essentially 1 hoof. And we can even see how the front foot went from being more of a foot to more of a, this actually looks, in my opinion, more stable, because it looks more like it's rooted onto the ground. But yeah, it's up to you guys how you interpret that. But that's the fossil evidence. What we're going to do now, and we already talked about fossils. We spent a whole lesson talking about evolution of horses. Let's stop talking about horses, right? We're done. Homology. And homology is the study, and this is something I do want you to write down, is the study of the similarities between organisms. These similarities are caused by organisms descending from a common ancestor. So, for example, looking at this picture on the right, and then we're going to look at a very similar picture. This is the picture of like the hand structure of different animals. And you can see here that most animals seem to have the similar structure with their hands. One thing you can tell is you can actually see this green bone here, the ulna and the radius. So notice how these two bones come together and they make a hole between them. Okay, you can see that hole in the dog's one because you can see the gap here. You can also see that in the bird and in the seal. See the little gap? That same structure is across all of them. Now, for something like the horse, it's a very, very small structure. And for something like in the bat, structure is also very small. But you get the idea. Now, with the human, you can see there are fingers, phalanges. You can see that a bat is just like long phalanges. So in fact, a bat is like, a bat's wing is just its hand. It's got really spread out. The seal also has phalanges, right? But it's got long ones they're going to become its fin. Even a bird sort of has at least one finger that's sort of being morphed together. Whereas the dog and the horse have sort of pushed all their phalanges together. They don't really have much phalanges. The horse turns it into a hoof, whereas the dog, most of you guys have seen dogs that've got like claws and stuff, but they don't really have fingers that they can grab onto things. And then you could also compare, you can look at other parts of it too, but we're not going to delve too deep into looking at these things. What they can do is the differences between animals and organisms, doesn't matter, it can be plants as well, can point to the selection pressures that cause divergent evolution. Why does the fingers of a bat, the phalanges of a bat are much longer than the phalanges in a human? Why did that occur? Well, because bats needed to fly, and so therefore they turned their fingers and their hands into wings so they could fly, rather than humans that use their phalanges to act as things that could pick objects up. And a seal used its phalanges, its fingers, to turn into paddles that allowed it to push its way through the water. So that's why they're really long, but they're not long and spread out like a bat. They're long and together. So, that understanding how these things are formed is actually kind of important. By the way, anatomy, I keep using the word anatomy. Let's define that. Anatomy is the study of body structure. So what we're doing now is comparative anatomy. We're comparing different anatomies. I'm going to keep this slide up for another 30 seconds or so, and then I'll change the slide to the next one. I know there's a fair bit of text on this slide. I think this is probably the biggest text slide out of all of them, but yeah, I'm pretty sure this is the biggest text slide out of all of them. So from here, it's all downhill. So from here, it's pretty easy. Does anyone have any interesting questions? Oh, question. I will take a question. I will not necessarily be able to answer. Nope. Oh, Leaky doesn't have a question. No stress. Yeah, with the radius and the ulna, I'm pretty sure I actually didn't know there were separate bones. I actually thought it was just one bone. I think you can break your radius or your ulna and not break the other one, and that's why you don't need to wear a splint. I think if you break your arm, you can just wear a cast. But you don't want to break your humerus. If you break your humerus, then you're in a lot of pain. Yeah, I would have failed PE class. As I don't know, I actually haven't broken any bones in my body or in my arm, so I don't actually know whether or not I actually don't know that stuff too well, but yeah. So you can break, whereas if you break your humerus, you're gonna have to have some kind of splint to make sure that it's stuck together so that you can, so be
So
okay.
different, like all of it. Oh, are they
Which
all like
one?
kind of the same structures? They're just like, yeah, they're just weird. So what?
Yeah, that's one of the main things that you pretty much nailed it. They're all the same structure, so they're all the same. They've all got the same parts, the same bones. The bones are all connected to each other, so all of them have phalanges. They all have a radius and an ulna. They all have a scapula. They all have a um, they all have a capella, but they're all sort of arranged differently. They've got different shapes. They're all connected the same, but they've got different shapes. And the reason that they have different shapes is because they're like, oh, well, they're specialized. It's kind of like the idea is, it's kind of like the idea is, I don't know, let's think of a really dumb example. Okay, the first example I can think of is a knife. Okay, you might go, oh shit. Okay, so let's think of, well, you've got like a knife. You can have a box cutting knife, right? That opens up boxes. That's great for opening up boxes, but that's not going to do a great job if you're trying to cut up like zucchini for your dinner. So you've got kitchen knives. And that's great for cutting up food, but kitchen knives are not going to do the job when it comes to cutting through something like wood. So that's why you have like knives for cutting through wood, and so you have wood knives and stuff like that. But they're not going to be great for dealing with boxes, and so you actually have specialized knives for specialized jobs, and that goes for all things. You have specialized saws for dealing with specialized jobs. Like you have saws that can cut through metal, saws that can cut through wood, saws that can cut through bread. They've got specialized saws to deal with specialized things. So just like that, we have, we all have arms, we all have hands, but different animals have specialized arms and hands to deal with specialized jobs. Our arm and hand is great when it comes to picking up objects. When it comes to swimming through the water, doesn't do that, or running quickly on our hands. It's not really it's not designed for that. But a dog, yeah, their arms are essentially are designed for running quickly. The bats, their arms are designed for flying. Seals, their arms are designed for paddling through water. So it's like, how are their bodies designed? One thing I will point out though, and I do because I want to always remind you guys this, because I don't want you to think. Obviously, a seal doesn't go in the halfway through the womb and think, you know what, I'm going to design my hand to make it easier for me to paddle. It's not a choice by them, it's a choice by their DNA. It's something that they've evolved over millions of years. And again, even then, it's like, it doesn't not like all the seals got together and thought, you know what would be good? Let's change our evolution so we have a big hand. No, that's natural selection. If it turns out that having a structure like this for your hand is actually beneficial for your survival. So then they survived, have more children, and therefore that's how it changed. What happens when you sprain your ankle? I actually do not know how spraining the ankle works. I believe it would be, if I had to guess, I think it'd be a muscle issue, not a bone issue, because obviously, yeah. But I'm not actually 100% sure there. So you might have to look that one up on your own, unfortunately. So comparative anatomy. So this is pretty much the same slide. It's pretty much the same picture. It's just we've got a couple of different animals this time. We've got some frogs, we've got a bird, we've got a turtle. But yeah, you can see for these, again, you can see the radius and the ulna. You see how there's a gap between them here. There's a gap between them for the whale. There's a gap between them for the turtle. Most of them seem to have a gap. And that you can also tell that they all have like these long finger things. The bird even has sort of a finger thing at the end of its wing. So you can actually use these to compare these different things. The arrangements and order of bones and the shapes and size of organisms are compared to one another. That's how you do comparative anatomy. This may suggest how close a common ancestor is. So you might look at something like, I don't know, let's look at the whale and the turtle. And the whale and the turtle, these structures, out of all the structures, in my opinion, these structures look the most similar. They both have, and so they may look similar because they've got a common ancestor and it's really close related to them. They may look similar because of not common. So they may look similar because of a common ancestor, but they may also look similar because, again, they may also look similar because of, what's that word? I've forgotten it. How did I forget it? I'm actually supposed to be teaching it to you. The word is convergent evolution. Thank you. Oopsies, I've gone way past it. So these might actually look similar because of convergent evolution. It's like, oh, well, it makes sense to have long fingers because that makes it easy to paddle. So it could be one of those two things, but we'd have to sort of look at them and see. We'll find fossils of ancient whales and ancient turtles and see if they were more similar or less similar. And then maybe they came from the same thing. But we'd have to look at them. And yeah, so this gives us a lot of clues as to what's going on. I'm not going to go too much into these bones because I've already gone through the bone structures. But yeah, look at the frog. The frog is very similar to the turtle as well. So you might go backwards. In fact, the frog looks, yeah. One of the ones that's really radically different, in my opinion, is the horse. And that's because, yeah, the horses have evolved to be specially designed to move very quickly along the plains. So whereas, you know, all these other animals have evolved to deal with their environments. And that's why their bone structures have evolved to deal with their environments. Okay. I'm going to change the slide now. If you need a little bit longer, let me know. But I'm changing the slide now. So now we're moving away from the A, the anatomy section, moving into the M, which is the biology section. So this is the only part that I want you to copy down. DNA and proteins of different organisms can be compared. So I cut that down a lot. So now that we have, of course, you have to think about this. For poor Darwin, Charles Darwin, he didn't have access to DNA. DNA was only properly, I think DNA was only really properly explored, extracted, and, you know, modeled in the 1970s, but don't quote me on that. I can't remember exactly. I'm going to say 70s, but I'm not sure. But yeah, so ultimately, but when we started to get DNA, and we started to look at DNA of rats and DNA of pigs and DNA of dogs, we could actually, instead of comparing the body structures of a dog to a rat, or the body structures of a dog to a human, we could look at the DNA. We could look at the blueprints and say, well, according to this DNA, how similar is a rat to a dog? How similar is a pig to a human? And we can look at it from a DNA standpoint. Now, and also from proteins, you might be like, oh, well, for example, humans might have a protein called lactase, which allows us to process milk. Well, you know, a dog might have a similar protein, but it might be a little bit different because, you know, dog's milk is different, puppy milk is different from human milk. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure with that one. I'm going a bit off tangent here. Let's come back to the point. There's also some unused genetic code. So then there's a lot of genetic code. If you remember when I was talking about genes, I said, you know, a lot of the genetic code is not even used. We have a lot of junk DNA, and some of that DNA, pardon me, might even give you clues into ancient evolutionary past. It's like, wow, look, we've got some, if you look through our DNA, like there are some parts to our DNA that are very, very similar to like plant DNA. Like you can find some stuff and it's like, wow, cool. It's like, you know, so somewhere lost in the junk of our DNA, there might be a section in there. It's like, this is how you make a flower. And it's like, well, you know, we don't need that anymore because we're humans. We don't have flowers, but we've still got that, like, it's like when you keep all your, it's like when you keep your maths workbook from year 7 or grade 5, and you put it and you think I might use this one day, and then you never use it. It's like, you know, if someone goes through your stuff, it's like, wow, check it out. They've still got like their maths textbook from grade 5. It's like, yeah, it's, you know, just a piece of junk that I've got in my room. It's like the same sort of thing. It's like DNA hangs onto junk, and it hangs onto this, like, also it's like, oh wow, your DNA has like the complete code on how to make a flower. It's like, yeah, but we don't use it. And sometimes you might have sometimes when your DNA malfunctions in a certain individual, sometimes that particular piece of DNA might get switched on, and so you might have some weird growth on your arm or something, you know, something odd. But yeah, we're not going to get too deep into that because I'm not actually equipped to answer all the questions that you may have. The more closely related two species are, the more similar their DNA sequences. So that sort of should hopefully make sense. If you've got two organisms, if you've got a human and a chimpanzee, and it's like if you take a chimpanzee and a human, and they've got 99% of their DNA matches, it makes them, for the human and the chimpanzee, look pretty similar. You take a dog and a wolf and you compare their DNA, you might be like, wow, they're 99% similar. So you'd be like, okay, there's something going on here that's, you know, these things are quite closely related. In fact, and this is actually probably one of the biggest proofs of in the recent memory of the fact that all living things are related, DNA itself, is evidence of evolution. If you think about DNA is really a very, very complex molecular structure. Now, when I talk about molecules, if you remember when I talked about water, I was like, have a look, you've got a water molecule here. And we talked about carbon dioxide molecule. And we were like, yeah, great. DNA is huge in comparison to these basic molecules, and it's complex, and it's got a system in place, and it's coiled up in this special way that allows us to replicate. DNA is really quite a complex molecular structure. So it'd be unlikely that, you know, it'd be unlikely that every single organism on the planet discovered DNA. What's more likely is one living thing discovered DNA, and then everything descended from that original DNA. So all DNA. So that's why DNA is evidence of evolution. If you didn't have DNA, like, it's unlikely, if you didn't have DNA, you'd be like, well, okay, what's going on? This sort of, I'm actually going to take this on a little bit of a tangent here, because I know that you guys are copying this down. This sort of is a little bit of one of the reasons why we have to be very careful when we look into space. Because when you look into space and extraterrestrial life or aliens, it's like they didn't evolve with DNA, so they won't have evolved with DNA. So, like, we have to be very careful when we look at alien life as to what we think is alive and what we think is not alive. We could very easily look at a living thing and say, well, that thing's obviously dead, when actually it's not. It's just it doesn't use DNA in its sequence. So, but it would still need some. I think if there's life, it would still need some kind of molecular blueprint or something. But you know, DNA is just a really useful way to get that molecular blueprint going on. So yeah, I'm going to keep this slide up for that's, by the way, it's ding ding ding, that's the end of period 1. I'd like just to try to get this stuff done so I can give you guys a chance to work on 3.9. I've only got about 3 slides left. So we should be pretty good. We should be done by about 10 o'clock, I reckon. But let's see if we can get this done this last little bit. So I'm going to keep this up for another 20 seconds or so. If you need some more time, please let me know. But yeah, after about 20 seconds, we're going to jump to the next idea. So, jumping to the next idea, now that we've talked about how, more closely related, the more similar your DNA is, the more closely related you are, let's look at some things from different animals and humans. So, percentage of genes from other organisms that also occur in Homo sapiens. Deep genetic homology. So this is still technically homology. You're still comparing organisms. So for example, if you take a mouse, 86% of the genes in mice are also occur in humans. So if you can be like, oh, look, there's a gene for controlling hair length. Wow, that same gene is in a mouse. There's a gene for controlling how big an eye is. That same gene is in a mouse. We've got genes, we'll have genes like that gene. We've got genes in mice that tell them how long to make their tails. We still have genes in like human beings that say how to make a tail. That's why we have a tailbone. We just don't have a gene that says make a tail. So there's going to be some genes that are different, but yeah, 86% of the genes are similar. 44% in a fruit fly. Worms, we share 25%. Yeast is 30%. That's the part that got me. I mean, you guys might be like, wow, we're 86% similar to a mouse. That's insane. What got me was we are more similar in genetics to yeast than we are to a worm. Worm, in my opinion, is a living, moving thing. Yeast is just like, yeast is like single cell organism. How the heck are we, oh, okay, whatever. Amoeba, which is also another single cell organism. Bacterium, single cell organism. Mustard plant, 19%. We're more similar to a single cell organism than we are to a mustard plant. What the hell? What happened? But that makes sense. And so you can actually just compare these things and you can be like, okay. This also gives you reasons as well as to why, this is why, a human and a fruit fly and a human and a rat can't breed because we're just too genetically different. Yeast infections when you, no, you don't have to write this slide down, by the way. This is just a quick little heads up. And the yeast infections when you actually end up with like yeast growing inside of your body, it's kind of gross, but it happens. And yeast is, I think, no, yeast is not a fungus. Oh, maybe it is. No, it's not. I don't think yeast is a fungus because that'll be a fungal infection. I think yeast is just a single cell organism. So I think it's like I think yeast is like, I think yeast is a type of bacteria, I think. Oh man, okay. Sorry, asked a really weird question. It's like, in theory, if someone had a yeast infection, could you use the yeast to make bread, like human bread? And then Tina's like, gross. Let me tell you a disgusting story that I heard recently. So what was it? I can't remember what it was called. My wife told me this story and she found it on YouTube and I was like, what the hell? And she's like, the weird shit you find on YouTube. What it was is it was a human that had a yeast infection in his stomach, I think. And I'm not sure if I think he may have like got the infection on purpose. But what he did is that he then ate a bunch of fruit. Like, okay, yeah, so what? You shouldn't eat fruit and bread and stuff. Yeah, so what? But the thing is that he did this on purpose because what would happen is that his body would process the fruit but the yeast got to the fruit before the yeast got to the fruit before the body did. And because the yeast got to the fruit before the body did, what the yeast did is it processed the fruit first. And what happens when yeast processes fruit and sugars? It makes alcohol. And so what his body did is his body converted the fruit to alcohol. And so he was getting drunk off his face by eating like strawberries and apples because his body was making alcohol. He had like one of the highest alcohol contents, like blood content that you can get, because essentially he's not making alcohol, drinking alcohol. His body is making alcohol, human alcohol. And yeah, it was one of the weirdest things that I've ever heard. I can't remember what the name of it was. I'm gonna look up the name of this after the lesson, but it was like, yeah. So to answer your question, yes, your body can, yeast, like ultimately your body, by the way, like the human body has got so many different organisms just rattling around inside of it. We've got parasites, we've got like bacteria in our gut that helps us digest food. We've got like different funguses growing on us that sort of don't really pose a problem. But we've got so many, and like you have nits in your hair. You've got so many different things that just hang out in your body. It's just a cool place to be. So the human body is filled with other organisms, just all doing their own thing. So it's just like it's a weird place. How do brain amoebas work? I'm not too sure about brain amoebas. I'm not too sure about amoebas in general. I believe they're single cells and I believe they can infect things, but I'm not sure how they work. They eat your brain. Yeah, they're not good. I don't know how they eat your brain, but yeah. Let's get back to the lesson. As I said, I've only got 3 slides left, so let's talk about those slides and get them done. So firstly, here's the same pretty much idea here, but now put into a picture form. So you can see that rhesus monkeys, and on the left here it says number of amino acids. So we're not actually talking about DNA or genes anymore. We're talking about amino acids. If you guys remember, amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So, you take your DNA and that tells you what amino acids you need to put together to get certain protein. Now, I think there are, I can never remember this. I think there's 21 or maybe 22 amino acids that humans have and we need. And of course, some of these are very, very similar for rhesus monkeys. In fact, number of acids that differ. So we have about 10 amino acids differ between us and monkeys. We have 25 differ from mice. Chickens, as many as 40 differ. Whereas frogs, we have a lot more different. And then if you look at like a lamprey, which is like, a thing that it's very different. So again, this is using proteins. So amino acids and proteins to compare us to different animals. So it's another way you can look at the molecular biology, what molecules are inside of the living thing that allow us to link it to. So this is actually this is the second last idea that I wanted to talk about. Similar genetics. And the more similar two organisms' DNA, the closer they are related. And I've already said that, but I'm saying it again. So you don't have to copy it down if you don't want to, but I want you to copy this next part. The human and chimpanzee's genomes are almost identical. The DNA sequences are 99% the same. If so, if we have similar genomes, then why do we look so different? That's a pretty good question. Why do you guys think we look so different from chimpanzees? We're supposed to be 99% similar. Why do we look so different? What do you guys think? we're just a different breed, we're built differently. But if we're a different breed, then why do we have such similar genetics? Now, I actually stole this slide from another source. Even though, and so because I stole this slide from another source, I don't necessarily have the correct answer. I've got my opinion or my answer that I think, and so I'm going to put down what I think the correct answer is, but it's not necessarily the correct answer. So feel free, if you want to research the correct answer and correct me and say, so you're wrong, you know, I will be like, thank you so much. But let's talk about what the correct answer is, or what I think the correct answer is. I think the reason is this: 1% is still a large difference. Okay, so 1% is still a large difference. And so we may look similar, but the 1% makes us look different. Also, behavior plays a role. That's what I would sort of say. So, for example, one of the other reasons, the other reason why I've got this evidence is that if you compare, I think it was like, if you compare two human beings' DNA, so if you compare your DNA with my DNA, right? And you go, well, how different are they, right? We, human to human, I believe the difference is about 0.1%. So even though if you take someone like, I don't know, you take someone like, if you take someone like, I don't know, let's take Kevin. Because if you take Kevin and you compare Kevin to someone like Lena, and you go, right, these two people look very, very different. Like, even though they look different, their DNA is only different by 0.1%. That means if you changed like a handful of genes in Kevin, you could get someone that looks identical to Tina. And when I say handful, I'm not talking about like, you know, you have to go through and replace every single gene. You only have to replace 0.1%, 1 in every 1,000 genes. Now, there are still thousands upon thousands upon thousands of genes, or millions of genes, but you only have to replace 1 in every 1,000. So what I want you guys to think about is this: if human beings can look so different from one another, right? We can look so different from one another, and yet we are only 0.1% different. Imagine how different we would look if we were 1% different from each other. And that's how you go from human beings to something like chimpanzees. They are 1 full percent different. So that's why they look so different from us. If they were only 0.5% or even 0.2%, then maybe we'd be looking at something that looks very, very similar to us. They may be a completely different species, but they may be very similar. 1% is relatively large. When you start to get bogged down in maths and science, you'll start to realize that even though 1%, when you are younger, you're like, oh, 1 in every 100, that's such a big number. it's such a small number, you know, it's so rare. When you start to look at it, 1 in 100 is actually pretty big in comparison to something like 0.1, 1 in 1,000. 1 in 100, if I asked you, if I gave you 100 cards, or asked you to find one of them, it would take you about maybe 2 or 3 minutes to find it. If I gave you 1,000 cards and I told you to find the one with the Joker on it, that would take you a lot longer. If I gave you 10,000 cards, that would take you even more time to do. So 1 in 100, yeah, think about 2 decks of cards. If I give you 2 decks of cards and I say, here, find the Joker, you know, it wouldn't be too difficult to do. It would take you a couple of minutes. But yeah, anyway, sorry, I'm going off track here, but that's my opinion. I don't know if that's the correct answer. Please feel free to check it. I'm also not 100% sure of this number. I'm pretty confident with it, but I'm not 100% sure. You'd be more than welcome to check that out for me. The last bit here is embryology. Now, embryology is probably the creepiest one out of all of these ways, but still it is one that we should talk about. Embryos, the earliest stage of development for plants and animals, can be compared. The reason embryos are really good to compare is because embryos of all birds look very, very similar. Embryos of all like lizards look very, very similar. So you can actually, you know, get an idea. Have a look at this top row here. In this top row, we have a lizard, we have a tortoise, we have a pig, and we have a human. Now, these look relatively similar. When you start to get more and more developed, that's when it starts to look more and more different. But they still look very similar, which gives you clues that they all sort of like animals that are they're all related. You might get to this point here and say, hey, look at this one is very different from this one here. You can see the eye structures in the last two are different from the eye structure in the first two. That's because these first two are lizards or reptiles, whereas these last two are mammals. So yeah, it's very creepy and weird, but still. Different vertebrates may appear similar as embryos and share common traits, but change as adults. If you look at these two embryos here of a pig and a human, they're pretty similar, but they will later on change to look very, very different. Especially even here, if you go further back, these two embryos sort of match, at least for the start. Yeah, embryology is just another way that we can study evolution. Sorry, I was stretching. This is the last slide that I'm going to talk about today. As I said, is the creepy one. This is E. So we've talked about F, which is fossils. A, which is comparing anatomy, which is like looking at different arms and stuff for different animals. You don't know, also comparatively, you can also look at other things. You can look at behavior. You can look at stuff like that. M is molecular. We're looking at DNA and genetics and things like that. And then E is got to do with embryos. So how do they look at? All right, let's give this another 30 seconds. Are there any questions about today's lesson so far? Is anyone sitting here being like, whoa, can you re-explain that or something like that? I was confused by this. I actually thought that these were 12 different embryos, but they're not. They're the same embryo. They're just over different life.
Same?
Hmm?
Are they the same?
They're not all the same, but like these three are the same. They're just different stages.
Oh.
That's what I was confused about by the picture. And these three are the same. They're just different stages.
Oh.
So one of the parts you're supposed to focus on is looking how similar all of these different.
I know, they all look the same.
Yeah, they all look the same, even though one's a lizard and one's a human. But by the by a little bit later, they start to look different. You can sort of tell, like the shell, you can sort of tell the snout versus the nose. You can sort of tell that the tail is it's really developed here, whereas we don't have a tail, stuff like that, you know? But, you know, so it sort of says is that, yeah, sure, we are different, but maybe we are all related at some point because the embryos all look the same. It actually takes, like, you can tell that these two are different from these two at this point here. So that sort of tells me that these two are more similar and these two are more similar. So it gives you an idea of like, okay, cool. And then by here, you can tell each of these are unique. So that sort of says, okay, so humans and pigs are probably more closely related because their embryos look similar than humans and lizards. They're humans and lizards, you have to go all the way back to pretty much the start before you can sort of say that they're, you know, similar. Okay, so what I'd like you guys to work on now is 3.5 is due today. So if you haven't finished 3.5, you haven't submitted it, get that submitted today.